All right, how's everybody doing? It is the week that we are covering theories of social reaction, right? And there are really two groups of theory, and just like weeks past, there's an older theory, really from the 50s and 60s, really became really popular during the 60s, but and then the other is a newer theory, reintegrative shaming, that incorporates a lot of ideas from labeling theory. It also incorporates some ideas from deterrence and rational choice theory, right? And we'll talk about that. All right. So first, we're going to cover labeling theory, and then eventually we'll get to the other theory, reintegrative shaming, right? And if you're following along in the PowerPoint, um, well, um, let's not start at the very beginning, but let's skip to deviance as a social construction. So this is slide 3. And I'll return to the points that are made in slide 2. Central to labeling theory, right? And these are called theories of social reaction. So they really focus, concentrate, emphasize the things that come after the deviant act, right? Or the thing that comes after the crime, right? Not the things that come before, right? Which is mostly what we've been talking about before. Everything that precedes kind of causes of things. So this is, concentrating on acts after that, right? And it's really important to understand that this comes from symbolic interactionists. Labeling theory does. So it has a lot to do with symbols, interaction, identity, public identity, self-identity, how those things change, right? How their meanings change, right? Central to symbolic interactionism is this idea of a social construction, right? You might have heard, and you should have heard in other sociology classes, that all sorts of things are social constructions, right? And deviance is a social construction. You might have heard race as a social construction, reality is a social construction, language is a social construction, identity is a social construction, right? And this is kind of central to the way that symbolic interaction is in labeling theories. And what happens, in order for there to be deviance, there must occur the social process. Now, some of this social process might have happened before we were alive, and we might not even have a historical record of it, right? But there must occur a social process between 3 types of actors, right? There are the people who make the rules, right? If we're talking about crime, those are typically legislators, and there's many laws that have written recently, but some before I was alive, right? And then there are rule breakers, or at least those who are believed to be rule breakers, right? Or criminals in the case of this class, where we're thinking mostly about crime, right? And then those who are the rule enforcers, typically that's police officers when we're talking about crime, but also judges and things of that sort. And so that there's this process where something has to be defined as deviant or criminal. Then someone has to be believed to have violated those rules or criminal code. And then there has to be someone that's aware of that is a rule enforcer, right? And this is a whole theory of deviance. It's not narrowly just about crime, right? And so. And labeling theorists argue that most criminology is just narrowly focused upon one of these things that's mentioned in slide 3, right? Most of criminology narrowly focuses upon the rule breakers and what are their characteristics, what is their background, right? But we need to, as a sociologist, look at the larger social context, the rules that were made, why they were made, right? And then how the rules are enforced, right? And all those things come together, and that's how crime is socially constructed, or deviance is socially constructed, right? So it problematizes crime, in much more so than previous theories, where it's kind of like everyone knows what crime is, and it kind of, other theories kind of take it for granted, right? And labeling theory really problematizes all of these things, right? And so I guess the next thing to move on is from chapter 4. Now I'm going to return to the chapter 2, right? Chapter 2, excuse me. Slide 2, right? So Paternoster and Bachman in our textbook talk about what makes some kinds of acts and not others criminal. What makes some kind of persons deviant or criminal and not others, right? The 1950s was a time where everyone just kind of vast consensus about what crime was and who criminals were. And in the 1960s were quite different, right? And people started asking questions like this. Why does, it doesn't seem like laws are passed just because of the amount of harm they're done to society, right? It seems like we define behavior of marginalized groups, poor groups, of racial and ethnic minorities. Those are more likely to be defined, and that has to do with power, right? And and other things are not defined, right? One of the things I teach in my drugs and society class is like, if we decided that we would ban substances based upon the harm that they do to society, probably the first substance we would ban would be tobacco, because tobacco kills 480,000 people approximately per year. And that's when we talk about all the legal drugs combined, that's, depending on the year, about a fourth of that, right? So that tells you, we're not banning substances because, they're the most harmful, right? If we were, we would ban tobacco and probably alcohol as well. But, why don't we? Well, this is drugs that are used by more affluent people. They're, there's an industry and they have lobbyists and stuff. And that's not true of other drugs, right? So it's not, we don't just pass laws about, harm that's done to society, right? And people started questioning these things, particularly those drug laws in the 1960s, because back then, marijuana laws were very strict and severe, right? And, a lot of people are like, it doesn't really make sense, right? Seems to be a lot more about power and who uses these drugs, and are those people anti-war and stuff like that, right? So these types of questions, right? The questioning of authority, the questioning of power, that had always happened, but it really comes to the surface, particularly in the late 60s, right? And labeling theory is part of this, right? Labeling theory questions authority, questions power, right? It challenges the status quo, and I think you'll see this when we get a little bit further into it, right? And here's a great example of this, right? Howard Becker, this brilliant symbolic interactionist and labeling theorist, really interesting guy. Part of his story is that he's an unbelievable jazz pianist, right? So he plays the piano, and this puts him into contact with kind of, other musicians, let's say. And during the 1950s, jazz musicians, that's kind of like avant-garde. It's not, during the 1940s and 50s, that's kind of cool music, right? It's not necessarily old people's music, young people's music. And a lot of the people that frequented those kind of social scenes did things like smoke marijuana and use other drugs and stuff like that. So him being a jazz piano player brought him into contact with this, I don't know, like criminal underworld or drug using subcultures and stuff like that. And that's pretty important part of his research, because he takes a sociological lens and he applies it. Now he's just playing piano at night and stuff. He's a professor during the day, right? And if you get on YouTube, you can watch some videos of him playing piano. It's really pretty impressive, right? All right, so Howard Becker, he's this big name, right? He's, maybe there's some other people in labeling theory, but he's probably one of the big ones, right? And he says social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction violates, by applying those rules to particular people and labeling them as outsiders. His book was named Outsiders, right? And so if you believe, like Becker does, that deviance is a social construction, then it's not inherent in the act, right? It's the result of a social process, right? By which people get together, right? Make laws, go look for the people who violate those laws, right? And arrest some of them, but not arrest the other ones, right? And place this label on them, right? And and so for labeling theorists, all deviance is relative, right? It's all relative. It's all a social construction. So rather than focus on the deviant, the person, right, that's believed to have violated the law or whatever, Becker focuses upon the process, right? A lot of times these are called process theories, right? And focus on the process by which people come to view others as deviant and then act accordingly, right? Social reaction, right? And so usually how I explain this to students is like, remember when you were in high school, right? And some people you knew, maybe they were friends, maybe they weren't. Start having minor brushes with the law, right? And some of those people, when their behavior comes to the attention of police officers, they might just get a warning or they call their parents or something like that. But some of them actually get arrested, right? Put handcuffs on them, take them downtown and to the jail, fingerprint them, right? Take a mugshot of them, right? And then put them in the jail cell and close that door and you hear that ominous noise, right? That series of steps is a ritual that everyone goes through, and that's often called a degradation ritual. It exemplifies a change in your status, right? And that process is really important. And there's other steps, later if you appear in front of a judge and they, convict you, or if they find you adjudicated as a juvenile, right? And that kind of marks the end of that. You've now been officially labeled, right? That official label that is placed upon you by police, the criminal justice system, judges, and stuff like that, marks a really important transition from an old identity to a new identity. And here's what it changes, right? It changes how you think about yourself, self-identity, and it changes how other people think about you, public identity, right? There's what I think about myself, there's what other people, and usually because of Cooley's Looking Glass Self, if you remember that from introductory sociology, usually self-identity and public identity are pretty similar, right? And that's, as Cooley said, we kind of look at the faces of others like a mirror, and we see ourselves in their faces, and through interaction we get a better sense of, hopefully, of how other people view us, right? And so that changes a couple of things, right? What you think about yourself, you might accept that, yeah, now I'm a criminal, now I'm a juvenile delinquent, right? And you might act in accordance with that. Right? And then other people, if you grew up in a town like I grew up in, where everyone gossips, they're like, oh, little Johnny, got in some trouble. I always kind of thought he was a bad kid anyway, and now he's a juvenile delinquent, right? And that's going to change all sorts of things when everyone in your community believes that, right? A lot of parents, if they're, care about their kids, they're going to say, stop hanging out with Johnny, right? He's a juvenile delinquent. He's a criminal, right? If they have a daughter, they're going to say, you can't date Johnny, right? So who's Johnny going to hang out with? He's probably going to hang out with a bunch of other people that are excluded from conventional society. What effect will that have? Well, he'll probably become more delinquent, more criminal as time marches on, right? He will be excluded from conventional activities, and this will further introduce him into illegitimate activities. He's going to hang out with all the misfits, all the people that don't fit in, right? And those are really important consequences of this label being placed upon you, right? Because it changes how you think about yourself and how other people, right? And if you live in a small town, also, like, when you get 18, you're looking for work and stuff like that, people are going to be very reluctant to hire you, right? And that can have some important criminogenic effects, can make it more likely that you will engage in criminal behavior in the future, right? Now, not every kid will have the book thrown at them, right? Some people just get warned, and some people, maybe the police won't even say anything to them, right? And a lot of that depends upon power, some of it upon race, some of it upon gender. The way that people speak to police officers can determine some of it. Who their parents are in the community can influence. And at certain times, people in the community can kind of become freaked out and crack down, right? So, like, when I was growing up, there was a war against drugs that was raging, and, like, they were arresting lots of people, right, for drugs, and kind of, even, what I think of as kind of minor drug involvement, like smoking marijuana and stuff like that, something that's a misdemeanor, right? But back in the 80s, people really, people get arrested, and they could get fairly long sentences back then, right? And they could be sent off to juvenile facilities and stuff like that. Not so much now, right? The drug war's really dried down. But you can have these times where people kind of become kind of freaked out and get more and more strict about things, right? I mean, we've seen that with like juvenile smoking, juveniles drinking, yeah. So reactions to deviance, they vary. They vary across time, they vary also according to who commits the crime, right? And how much power does that person have to resist that label being applied to them, right? If your family has more money, they can hire a lawyer, right? If they can speak in certain ways, they might be able to persuade police officers not to treat them and label them as a criminal, right? Of course, differences depending upon what neighborhood you live in. You live in a poor neighborhood and your family's poor, right? Which is typically the case if you live in a poor neighborhood. Then you're going to be less likely to resist that label, right? And I think most of us would say, like, they treat kids in Mountain Brook different than they treat kids in Bessemer, right? No doubt about it. All right, now that I've explained labeling theory, right? And I want to point out, kind of in a nutshell, what labeling theory has just told us. Labeling theory has really told us that what causes crime is the social reaction, right? So here's how it goes, kind of in a nutshell, right? Summarize everything that I just said over the last 20 minutes. What causes crime is you take this kind of sporadic delinquent behavior around 12, 13, or 14 that a lot of people engage in, right? But not all of them get caught. Like drinking underage, smoking marijuana, shoplifting, it's not felonies, it's not serious crime, right? But some of those kids, it comes to the attention of authorities, and some of them don't get warnings, they throw the book at them, right? That labels them, right? Because that label changes the way they think about themselves, their self-identity, and because it changes the way that other people, right? It increases the likelihood that that delinquent behavior that was sporadic becomes stable across time, right? And that's radical. That's a theory that's radically different than everything that we've talked about before, right? Because essentially it's saying, we wouldn't have as much crime if we didn't arrest these people and label them, right? And that's anti-authoritarian, right? It's like, the authorities are to blame for crime. Yeah. And the policy implications of that are like, don't arrest as many people, particularly juveniles, right? Because their criminal behavior will probably go away, right? Once they get 16, 17, 18, right? And the reason it doesn't go away is because the label is applied to them and it ruins their reputation, right? Now, you can imagine that some people like this theory, some people hate this theory, right? When I've taught this theory before in classes at other universities and I had police officers in the class, they hate this theory, right? They're like, oh, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen, right? But I do think labeling theory is onto something, right? There may be other causes for crime, but I do think that labels matter. And when labels are applied to people, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy that the person becomes what they're labeled, right? So I don't think they're completely wrong, although I believe there's other causes of crime in addition to this. Yeah. All right, so let's move on to chapter 2, because this idea that I just summarized is like punishing crime causes crime, right, is actually the opposite of another theory, and that's rational choice, right? Particularly deterrence theory. Deterrence theory, Beccaria, Caesar Beccaria, back in Italy in the late 1700s, right, said that if we punish criminals, and we do it in a way that's certain, swift, and severe, that should deter them, right? So what I want to point out is that we have two theories that are arguing completely opposite positions, right? One says, labeling theory, that punishing crime will increase criminal behavior. And the other one, punishing crime, if it's certain, swift, and severe, will prevent crime, right? Now that's, that's weird, right? You're saying like criminal behavior and punishment, two of the most important variables that we are interested in criminology and criminal justice, that one says that they're positively correlated, and the other one says that they're negatively correlated. That's unusual, right? And you see that, like, some people believe one, some people believe the other, right? And you might, like, I don't know, maybe it's even embarrassing to be a criminologist and find yourself in this situation, right? But there came a fella, Brathwaite, and he's like, I think I can resolve this. I think I can explain. It could be possible that one's right and the other one's wrong, right? Labeling theory is right, deterrence wrong, or it could be the opposite. Deterrence theory is right and labeling theory is wrong. Or you could have someone like Brathwaite come along and say it depends. It depends on how the punishment is carried out. It depends on who does the punishment. It depends upon whether a label is placed on the behavior or is it placed upon the person. And it also depends on what comes after the punishment. After the person is punished, are they kind of welcomed back in to society and like, all right, you did your time and now you're full membership with all membership privilege. Or do we punish people and stigmatize them for the rest of their life, right? That's Brathwaite's way of resolving that problem, where we have one theory that says it's positive, crime and punishment are positively correlated, and another theory that says they're negatively correlated. And I really like this theory, right? I mean, it's one of my favorites, right? And it's a relatively new theory, right? And Brathwaite is from Australia, right? And I think that's important, right? I think that's important because he brings some fresh ideas into these theoretical debates, right? And if he was educated in the United States, I think he probably would have picked a side, and it would have been labeling theory or it would have been deterrence theory, because that's what most graduate students do, right? But he resolves this theoretical problem. It's impossible for both of them to be right? And he basically says it depends. It depends on the nature of the punishment, what follows the punishment, who does the punishment, right? And this is the difference between reintegrative shaming and disintegrative shaming, right? And he argues that he argues that there are two different ways of punishing people and instilling shame in people when they're punished, right? One, he calls disintegrative, and really a great example of how you punish in a disintegrative, shaming way is you just look at the way the United States has done it, right? It tears people's relationships apart. It pulls them out of their community, out of their families, out of their place of work, right? Severs those relationships and it sends them to a prison, right? And it stigmatizes them. They have this label of a felon or an ex-con that's placed upon them, right? It creates a whole class of outcasts, of misfits, right? And the deviant label is not applied just to the behavior, but it's applied to the person, right? They are an ex-convict. They are a convicted felon, right? And that status of that label becomes their master status, right? And, they actually have to carry around an ID that says they're a convicted felon, right? When they apply for jobs, they have to check that box that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony, right? And that makes it difficult for them to get a job, right? So they get excluded from a lot of job opportunities just because they have to click. There are other ways that they're excluded too. If it's a drug offense, you're no longer available for public housing. You're no longer eligible for Pell Grants to go back to college, right? And these, the way that we punish, for the most part, in the United States, or at least the way we did, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, there has been some changes in the last 5 years, but it's pretty much disintegrative shaming, right? There have been some reforms recently that try to soften these things, but it's still pretty disintegrative shaming, right? So that's the type of punishment that, and that's consistent with labeling theory, right? Disintegrative shaming, right? Now the other type of shaming, the other type of punishment is called reintegrative shaming. If we want to use punishment in a way that reduces the criminal behavior, here's what we should do, right? And, if you want to find the best example of reintegrative shaming, study loving families, right? And this is where I really like this theory, because it gives us a lot of instruction about how to correct the misbehavior of our kids, right? And I've used this with my kids, right? So, I have an 8-year-old and I have a 10-year-old. I love them, right? I want the best for them, right? But just like all kids, they do things that are not good for them, that don't please me and their mother. And when that happens, I will recognize that misbehavior and I'll pull them aside, typically not in front of a bunch of other people, and we'll have a talk about it, right? And that needs to happen fairly quick, right? I can't wait days before I talk about their misbehavior. It won't be as effective, right? And I need to let them know that I'm not mad at you. It's your behavior, right? And there will be some type of sanction or punishment. Now, it will typically be like timeout for 10 or 15 minutes in your bedroom, right? Where you can't talk to other people. No phones, no tablets, or anything like that, right? Sit in your bedroom, 10, 15 minutes, put a timer on so I don't forget about my son. It is typically my son that I have to do this to more than my daughter. And then when that 10 or 15 minutes is up, I tell him to come back out. And his posture is typically all kind of making himself real small and kind of slumped over and doesn't want to make eye contact and stuff like that. And I tell him, come here, buddy. He's like, and usually he'll ask, are you mad at me or something like that? He's like, no, buddy, I'm not mad at you. I love you. You know, you just did something that you shouldn't have done, but you're a good kid. I love you. I'll always love you, you know. And usually he'll want a hug, and I'll want a hug too. And after I give him that hug, I don't bring up that misbehavior again, right? So I've done that way in a way that, you know, it's not about him. I haven't altered his identity at all, right? He should not alter his identity either, right? Because he's a good person. That, yeah, they did a bad thing, but the way to, you know, not be confronted about this, just don't do the bad thing again, right? And I don't bring it up over and over. I don't, you know, later the next day or that night remind him of what he did, right? When it's over, right? And the hug is gestures of reacceptance. You're welcome back into the family, into society, and everything's fine, right? That is reintegrative shaming at its best, right? And let me point out a few things about that, right? It was done within loving social relationships. He knows I love him, right? I tell him that I love him. I tell him I want the best for him. He knows that I want the best for him, right? That's different than what people get from police officers and judges, right? They don't typically love the people they're arrested, right? But there has to be those bonds of trust in order for reintegrative shaming to happen, right? And after there's community disapproval, it has to be followed by gestures of reacceptance. Your punishment is over, right? I don't bring it up again, right? I have not altered the person's identity, right? It does not create deviant subcultures. It does not make the kid think, well, I am a bad kid and stuff like that. I'm going to go hang out with all the other bad kids, right? He's my son, despite him getting in trouble, he still thinks he's a good kid, and he is a good kid, and I tell him that, right? So the deviant label is applied to the behavior. It's never applied to the kid. So I never tell my son that he's, you know, bad or, you know, anything like that. It's always the behavior is bad, right? And yeah, and so the behavior is you just stop the behavior, right? And, you know, we'll be fine, right? And in another place that Brathwaite believes that we can find reintegrative shaming, he's actually done a lot of research on this, is societies that are, I guess like more tribal in nature. So he studied Maori tribes, which are the indigenous people in New Zealand, Aborigines tribes. He's also studied Native American tribes within the United States. And he found, and what he finds is that when they punish, it tends to be this reintegrative shaming, right? And they're much better at preventing future misbehavior than we are in modern societies, right? In modern societies, Brathwaite believes we just get this wrong. And it's largely because we've created these bureaucracies to do this, right? And the bureaucracies are cold, right? And they're impersonal, right? By their nature, they are, right? And they're designed to process large numbers of people per day, right? They don't have time to get to know people before they sentence them, or, and he makes this argument that a lot of indigenous tribes do this much better than we do, right? In America, right? And that if we learn from them, and we do have a great deal to learn from them, right? That we could control crime better than we do, right? Which is ultimately what we want to try to do, right? And and so in a lot of Native American tribes, and there's similarities in Aborigine tribes and Maori tribes as well. The tribe will typically have like a council of elders, older, respected people, that whoever is thought to engaged in some misbehavior or criminal conduct or something like that, they'll go in front of the council of elders, and they respect all those people, right? And because they respect those people, when those people voice their disapproval, they will experience shame, right? Whereas in our society, if we go in front of a judge, police officers, a lot of people don't experience much shame because they don't know those people. They don't necessarily respect those people, right? But when it's a council of elders, people that everyone kind of agrees are respected people in the community and the tribe, then they experience shame. And that is not, shame is a very unpleasant emotion, and most people would like it to go away, right? And there will be a sanction, a punishment, but it will be very short in duration. And then they will try to reintegrate that person back in, and they'll actually have like ceremonies that mark the end of punishment and their entry back in to the community with full membership rights. They don't, in our society, you lose a lot of your rights if you're a convicted felon. Can't vote in a lot of cases. Difficult to get a job. You're stigmatized for the rest of your life, right? But they will actually forgive the person and welcome back in, and reincorporate them back into society, right? And a lot of important research shows, like, I'll be damned, they got this right in a way that we can't, and we got a lot to learn from Native American, Maori people. Really, all of these, one of the things about indigenous tribes is they tend to be really tightly knit in a way that modern society is not, right? Our society is, not cohesive, right? Not tightly knit, right? And that causes a lot of problems for crime, Even Durkheim pointed that out a long time ago, right? Turns out that, other pre-modern ways of organizing society and clans and tribes and things of that sort are actually much more effective at controlling crime, right? Yeah, that's it. I think that's, So, what Brathwaite says is like, sometimes when you punish crime, it creates more crime, like labeling theory suggests. Other times when we punish crime, it can actually have a deterrent. But it matters the conditions. It matters who confronts and punishes the person. Are they punishing the behavior? Are they punishing the person? Are they stigmatizing the person, excluding them from mainstream society? After the punishment is over, is it a long punishment, a short Are they welcomed back in with those gestures of reacceptance? Is all forgiven after the punishment? Or do they continue to remind the person that you did this? All right. You guys have a nice day. That's everything on social theories of social reaction.